Okay. Hi, biology.
Good morning.
Hello.
Oh, it's nice to hear your voices. This is our last Zoom meeting. Next week, we are going to be meeting in person in class. Oops. Hang on a second. Admitting some of these later students. Okay. Next week in person. I'm excited about it. So, announcements. We took the exam on Monday. I'm about 2/3 of the way getting those graded. So those will be finished in certainly before the weekend. And there's nothing else due this week. I like to give you a little bit of time off either right before or right after exams, because I know they can really frazzle your brains. We're going back in person next week. So there are going to be a couple of changes. The quizzes, for example, will be given during lecture. Homeworks are still going to be on Canvas, and there is going to be a homework assignment next week. But the next quiz isn't going to be until Monday, February 21st. I prefer to give quizzes on Mondays, so you have the weekend to kind of think about the material, do a little bit of studying, reviewing the material. And I give the quizzes at the very beginning of lecture. So we take the quiz and we're done with it. If you're late to lecture, you're not given extra time. So work really hard to show up on time. Exam 2 is going to be on Wednesday, March 2nd. We are going to be taking that exam in class. And it starts with the material from, it should say February 9th lecture, today's lecture, and covers through, February 28th lecture. Now, if you haven't come to campus before, or haven't come or didn't come last semester, there are processes that you need to go through to be allowed on campus. So there's an app. It's called the My VCCD app, and it's available for free on the Apple Store or on wherever you get your apps. You also need to upload your COVID vaccine information for the college. We're not requiring boosters, but we are requiring vaccinations. And if you're not vaccinated, you won't be allowed to come to campus. When you come to campus, every time you come to campus, you need to open your app, answer the questions, and then it will notify you if you're allowed to be on campus or not. If you're allowed on campus, you need to drive to a check-in location. And I think they're in all of the big parking lots. And you show your app notification to the person at the check-in location. And you're given a wristband to wear. And these are colors and they're changed every day. And you need to keep them on while you're on campus. So this allows faculty and other employees of the college to just say, just look at your risk and see if look at your wrist and see if you're allowed to be on campus or not.
I do have a quick question about this.
Yes.
I plan on taking the bus, so I won't be driving very much, if like at all.
Good for you.
Where do I go if I'm taking the bus?
You can just walk up to one of the check-in locations.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. We're also supposed to be scanning QR codes whenever we enter a building or a room. And we are still going to be requiring masks. I know the state mandate is lifting, which in my opinion, it's about a month early to be lifting that. But while we are in class, you need to have a mask. It needs to cover your nose. If you have problems with your mask staying up, let me know. I got some tricks. And if you're using those really loose neck gaiter type things, those aren't masks. Those don't protect you very much at all. And if you don't have masks, I know a lot of local drugstores have free N95 style masks that they're giving out. But if you need more masks, just let me know. I can get you surgical masks, no problem. Okay. Are there questions on how we're going to be getting to campus next week? Give yourself some extra time. I expect a lot of people will be trying this out for the first time. What classroom are we in? Oh, let me pull out my syllabus. Ventura Multidisciplinary Center West 110. I'm going to put that in the chat for everybody.
And we're also meeting on Mondays, right? At the same time?
Yes. Okay. I can't quite see the problem, but I misspelled multidisciplinary. And yes, we meet Mondays and Wednesdays next week. Yep. Anything else you guys need to know? I'm expecting a lot of people to be a little bit late on Monday, so don't worry about it next week. We've all got to find the classroom and get checked in and all of that jazz. And it's all new, so not a big deal. All right. The next topic that we're going to be talking about is basically ecology. So exam 1 was all talking about cells and how cells function and some basic chemistry that you need to understand how cells function. Now we're going to go over some very, very basic ecology. So the first thing we have to ask is, what is ecology? It's the study of ecosystems and interactions between living organisms. Okay. So interactions between living organisms, that's pretty easy to understand. You can think of, for example, the wildebeest here are eating grass and they're hanging out with the zebras and I think those are topi. And there are some wading birds who are also hanging out in the water and drinking the water. If a lion comes along, he might eat one of the zebras or one of the topi. These kinds of things, you know, we're going to go into a lot more detail about them. But that's kind of the basics of interactions. When we say ecosystem, was that a comment or somebody accidentally unmuted?
Yeah, sorry, that was me.
No worries. Okay. An ecosystem is an area that includes with organisms that live in that area and the abiotic parts of that area. That's kind of a vague definition, right? What kind of area are we talking about? Well, the thing is, when we talk about an ecosystem, the size can vary depending on what you're discussing. So I can talk about the ecosystem of my yard and the plants and the animals that live there and the abiotic parts of that area. Whenever you see a scientific word that begins with A, that means not or without. So abiotic are the non-biological, the non-living parts of the area. So in my yard, that's the soil. That's water that's applied. That's the amount of sunlight that hits the plants in my yard. I can also talk about the ecosystem of the town of Ventura, or the county of Ventura, or the ecosystem of the Central Coast of California. So you can see we can talk about these at just about any scale you want to talk about. And of course, if we're talking about the whole planet and the ecology of the entire planet, we use the term biosphere. It's a fancy word to say, you know, living things and how they live on Earth. Okay, I'm going to erase this definition of ecology so that I can write some more over here. So when we talk about the abiotic parts of an ecosystem, we're talking about climate and soil. Climate is temperature. The average, the highs, the lows. It includes rainfall. Including how much rain and when does it happen? Is it year round or is it seasonal? The amount of sunlight. Southern California is closer to the equator than Washington State. So we're going to get relatively the same, well, much closer to the same amount of sunlight every day year round than people in Washington State. We'll get, generally, as we look at the whole year, we're going to get a lot more sunlight. And that also involves day length and intensity. And when we talk about soil, we're talking about things like minerals, organic material, how well it holds water, how fast it drains. These are all important characteristics of the soil that influence what kind of plants can live there, how fast they grow. So all of, or both of these, climate and soil, really determine what kind of plants can grow. The kind of plants determine what kind of animals can live there. So when we are describing ecosystems, the general way we describe ecosystems, or we define different ecosystems, is by common conditions. And that includes weather and climate, soil, types of organisms. Okay. So that's kind of the basics about what is ecology. What are we talking about here? Any questions on this part before we move on to a little bit more details? Okay. All right. So when we talk about ecosystems, we can talk about ecosystems in salt water, which are called marine ecosystems. We can talk about freshwater ecosystems, and we can talk about terrestrial or land-based ecosystems. So what we're going to start talking about is various kinds of marine ecosystems. And when we talk about kinds of ecosystems, we use the term biome. So a biome is, it can be in different places in the world, but it's going to have similar characteristics. So a coral reef is going to be a coral reef, whether it's off the coast of California, off the coast of Australia, in the Mediterranean. It's going to be characterized by similar conditions, specifically lighting. It's going to be characterized by lots of small fish that are living and breeding among the coral. Corals are going to be growing there. Sponges are going to be growing there. So we can really identify a coral reef as a coral reef no matter where it happens. And so that's an example of the biome. I think everything living is really cool, but yeah. Sponges, oh, are they immortal? Probably pretty damn close to it. So sponges are animals, very different from animals like mammals or fish. And you can cut off a piece of coral, put it in a different location, and both the original coral and the relocated coral will survive and grow. I mean, you can do that with a lot of plants too. You can take a cutting off of a plant and plant it somewhere else, and it grows into a new plant. It is really very, very different from what we see with most animals.
Kind of off topic, but you can also do that with a liver.
Yes. Well, your liver will regrow but you can't like take a slice of liver and make a new organism out of it, which is what you can do with a piece of sponge.
When I was 10, I got a liver transplant. They told me I got a piece of a liver, and now it's grown into a full liver. Just pretty
Yeah. That's one of the awesome things about livers,
Like
that they
liver.
can do that. Absolutely. Which means it's one of the few organs that you can have a living donor. It's very easy. Well, very easy. It's not very easy, but you can donate part of your liver to somebody else and you'll regrow it. And that person will grow liver and it works out well.
Wait, I have a question. So if
Yeah.
let's say a drinker and he takes off a piece of his liver, will the piece that grows back be healthier, making overall his liver a little bit healthier?
Only if there were lifestyle reasons that the liver was not in great shape to begin with. So cirrhosis of the liver from drinking too much and that kind of thing. Then the new liver would be healthier. Okay. So we're going to start talking about marine ecosystems. "75% of the Earth is covered in salt water." So these are the biggest ecosystems on the planet. And most of them are not well studied, which makes sense because it's not our native environment. We can go diving, but only for a little while and only to certain depths. And even if we're sending down deep sea submarines, we can only explore a tiny little piece of the ocean at a time. When we talk about the shallow ocean, there are two types of biomes. The first one is the coral reef. Very diverse in number of species. Yeah, okay. There's an interesting comment in the chat about oceans being technically deserts because they don't get much rainfall. Okay, that's true. We don't, I mean, an ecologist would probably not refer to an ocean as a desert, but you're right, it gets very little water. I would really argue against it not being very productive.
Does the rainfall flow into it?
Rainfall flows into it, water that ends up on land, certainly ends up in the ocean from rivers and that sort of thing. And the organisms that live in salt water have special adaptations that allow them to use that water. So sharks are not going to have, they're not going to have problems with dehydration. Humans would, yeah. But the things that live there can get plenty of water. When we talk about productivity in terms of the size, yes, if you take the productivity and divide it by the total area, it's absolutely going to be relatively low. But it's very spotty, and productivity is very high in some regions and very low in others. And one of the reasons you've got one of the places you have a lot of productivity is the coral reef. So we've got lots of different species there, and many young species will live there until they're bigger. Wow, bigger does not have 3 G's in it. Coral reefs are also very rich in terms of number of organisms. So there's a lot of diversity and a lot of individuals. So that's kind of the quick snapshot of coral reefs. Also in the shallow ocean, we have the surface of the ocean. Coral reefs tend to be in shallow water, but the surface of the ocean is also gets a lot of light and has a lot of living organisms. We call all of this plankton. It's just kind of a general term for all of these different kinds of things that live at the surface.
Is the theory that plankton was the first organisms to be on Earth?
It's possible that there are, that is one idea. It's generally believed that the first thing that would be considered a living organism was probably very much bacteria-like, and bacteria certainly does live in plankton. Where that happened is really hotly debated. It certainly could have been at the surface of the ocean. Some people think it happened very close to the shoreline of the ocean, but it's quite possible. Absolutely. So plankton consists of both plants, animals, bacteria, all kinds of different things. Lots of ocean-going animals live in the plankton when they're young. So a lot of fish, for example, will have what we call a larval stage. So the eggs will hatch into a larval stage that looks very, very different from the adults. And then at some point, they'll go through a metamorphosis and become adults. We can see this guy in the lower right corner. That is probably going to grow up to be a lobster. Most of these things, I couldn't tell you what they're going to grow up to be, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be a lobster. Don't see anything that's obviously a fish, but they look so different when they're young, it's hard to say. And a lot of these things are probably eggs too. There's probably a lot of these circles are probably eggs. Plants and plankton produce a lot of our oxygen. Estimates vary from 50% to 80% of the Earth's oxygen comes from plankton. So without this ecosystem, we'd be in a lot of trouble. Okay, so that's the plankton. Also near the surface, where are we? Are these guys. These little guys right here are krill. They live near the surface of the ocean. And I'm talking about them specifically because they are so important. They are what we call a keystone species for the open oceans. A keystone species means if that species disappeared, the whole ecosystem would collapse. If we lost krill, if some catastrophe happened and all the krill was wiped out, we would lose most of our whales. We would lose whale sharks. We would lose a lot of our bigger fish that we tend to eat, like tuna. The food chains in the ocean would just completely collapse. Most of the time when people think of keystone species, you think of something big that has a big impact, but it doesn't have to be something big. It can be something small. It's just something that's critical for survival. It's estimated that krill are possibly the most abundant animal on the planet, both in individual numbers and by mass. Yes, humans can eat them. Humans usually harvest them for krill oil, which is an alternative to fish oil. It's supposed to be good for your heart. Here's a secret. It really doesn't have an effect. And of course, harvesting krill for krill oil supplements means that things like this blue whale here aren't going to have as much food available. The blue whale is the largest thing that has ever lived on the planet, bigger than any of the dinosaurs. And they survive almost completely on these little tiny things. So they're a critical source of food for whales and whale sharks and a bunch of other fish.
I thought there were species that were bigger than the whale, like back in the dinosaur days.
Not the blue whale. The blue whale's the biggest thing ever. Well, animal. There are fungus that are larger than blue whales, but and those are alive today as well. What fungus? It is. I forget the exact name. It has honey in the common name. And they're found. The biggest one that we've found is in the Pacific Northwest. Most of it is underground. Can we see it? We can see the reproductive structures. We will talk about this when we start talking about living organisms, because I think it's, a fun thing to talk about. So when we talk about plants and animals, we'll also talk a little bit about fungus, and I'll talk about how incredibly big it is and
Doesn't
the name and all
oxygen have a role on how big organisms could be, which is why most animals were bigger than they are now in the dinosaur days, because there's more oxygen?
Yes, oxygen is a limiting factor. However, there have been times in the past where oxygen levels were higher than they are now. And at that point, there were giant dragonflies and centipedes that were like 8 feet long. There just weren't, I don't think there were any mammals at that period of time.
Okay.
Yeah. It's, oh, this is, God, you're getting me sidetracked here. What tends to happen is there are periodic times where the number of species and the number of individuals goes down dramatically, like at the end of the dinosaur era, right? The meteor hit the planet, killed off the non-avian dinosaurs. And what tends to happen after that is the number of species increases and gradually the size of the animals increase. But when there's another catastrophe, the big animals tend to be the ones that don't survive. So over time, you get these curves in animal size that go up and then down and then up and then down. But yeah, we're not at maximum oxygen yet. And yes, I can second those PBS YouTube videos. There's some really good ones out there. Okay, so that's the surface. Let's go a little deeper into the ocean. And let's talk about we're in the open ocean, kind of in the mid-range. When you go looking at different biomes in the ocean, there's a lot of different disagreements about how many there are and what they're called. So we're going to call this the open ocean mid-range. And this is below where light can penetrate. So it's dark all the time, but it's above the seafloor. So it's above the bottom of the ocean. It's kind of right there in the middle. And just so you're got an idea of this, the average ocean depth is 2¼ miles. So this is a huge part of the ocean. And this is the area that we think of when we say productivity is low. It's hard for us to collect fish from this depth. It tends to be pretty far down. It's hard for us to investigate it. Very, very poorly understood. What we see is animals. There aren't any plants here. The light can't get down there, so there's no photosynthesis. So the animals here survive on falling detritus, which has the special name marine snow. It's a pretty name for a not so pretty thing. Detritus means, you know, if an animal dies near the surface and starts to fall apart and little particles fall down, or animals in the shallow water poop and their poop falls down, that's what we're really talking about here. And despite the fact that that's kind of the base of the food chain for this area, there's a lot of diversity and a lot of weird animals. A lot of the animals are bioluminescent. So bio, living, luminous refers to light. These generally use bacteria to produce light. That's not the only way they produce light, but a lot of them do it this way. And so they'll have a light organ, and the light works to attract other organisms. And a lot of the animals that are bioluminescent are predators. So they're attracting something smaller to eat it. Will humanity ever have explored all of the ocean? Ooh, oh man, lots of good questions today. I think we would need a big jump in technology in order to be able to explore all of the ocean. So will we ever be able to do it? Maybe. A lot depends on, okay, a lot depends on climate change, because if climate change knocks civilization down or back a little bit, you know, that might make things a lot harder. I don't like to say it's not possible, but I would say it's not probable. How do bacteria produce light? There are chemical reactions that when those chemical reactions happen, they release energy in the form of light. And bacteria can do this. There are some animals that can do it. So fireflies, for example, there's a chemical called luciferase. It's a protein that they make that triggers the chemical reaction that releases the light. I don't have the details on exactly the chemistry going on, and that's probably quite a bit beyond the scope of this class anyway. Okay. So has anybody seen those anglerfish that have washed ashore here on the Southern California coast recently? Looks like no. Okay. So one of the best, what the heck? We've only got about half the class here. Let's go take a look. Okay, hang on just a second. Am I sharing the screen with you guys? Are you seeing the anglerfish?
Yeah.
Good, okay. So these things, we've had several of these wash up on shore down here in Southern California in the past couple of months. This is one of those deep sea anglerfish. It's got huge amounts of teeth. This is a lure that it uses to attract prey. So it's literally dangling this in front of its mouth, and this is going to have the bioluminescence. It's going to glow. And something comes along to investigate, and whoomp. These are also really interesting because I can tell you just from this picture that that's a female, because the males are tiny and they tend to, if they find a female, they attach to the side of the female. They literally bite her side, and eventually the males disintegrate except for their testes. So if you see one of these, it's always female. Okay, back to the PowerPoint. Now, when we talk about the ocean bottom, near shore ocean bottoms tend to be things like coral reef, sandy bottoms. There's light getting in there. There's photosynthetic organisms. But when we talk about the very, very deep ocean, we're talking about an area that's sometimes called benthic or hadal. Benthic generally, I mean, it's a term that refers to the bottom of the ocean anywhere. It's used more often for deep ocean floor. And hadal comes from Hades, which of course means hell. And if you look at this, this is what we call a black smoker. You can see why it might have been referred to as hell. So you want to talk about weird stuff going on. There's seriously weird stuff in this area, and very, very little is known about this area. We know that there's very high pressure, very low temperatures, and there's no sunlight. The organisms that live here, they can live, you know, there's a role for marine snow and what are called whale falls. When whales die, they fall to the bottom of the ocean. But there are also these hydrothermal vents. Hydro from water, thermal for temperature, vent. These are openings into the crust of the earth. And so this material is coming out from below the crust areas that are volcanic or earthquake related, and they are bringing up chemicals like methane and sulfur. And the food chain, the organisms that live here depend on that methane and sulfur. So there are bacteria that can use methane or sulfur to produce biological molecules, macromolecules. Which are then consumed by slightly larger things living in the area, and they feed crabs and worms and that sort of stuff. Generally speaking, these hydrothermal vents support life in a local area. And then there are other parts where there aren't any hydrothermal vents. We know even less about those. There's not a lot of life around. But a group recently sent a deep sea submarine down to the bottom of the ocean and collected samples of the sand at the bottom. And they looked at DNA. So there's a way we can look at DNA in a sample of soil or water and identify how many different species live there, and if we've seen them before, what they are. This was not a submarine with people in it. This was a remotely controlled submersible. The submarines that can make it all the way to the deep ocean are very rare and very expensive. So this sample, when they brought it up, 2/3 of the DNA belonged to organisms that are not known to science. And many of them don't have any known relatives. Okay. Aiden, you had your hand up, and I'm thinking, am I remembering that your name's not pronounced Aiden?
It's Adon. Sounds like an E.
Adon. Sorry about that.
It's okay. I was wondering, have you been to the deepest part yet or no?
One person has. Oh shoot, which one of the rich, those rich guys who are all having those space races, the ultra rich guys, one of them,
Musk.
like Musk, yeah. I don't know which one of them went down, but one of them has been down to the deepest part of the ocean as far as we know, which is called Challenger Deep. And he found a soda can there. Is it Jeff Bezos? I'll take your word for it. As far as I know, it is part of the Mariana Trench. Challenger Deep is the deepest part of the Marianas Trench. And as far as I know, only one person has been down that far. On the plus side, I'm pretty sure that submarine was donated to researchers. So theoretically, scientific researchers can use that sub. Yeah. It was not the James Cameron one. James Cameron, his sub can't quite make it to Challenger Deep. That's just an engineering marvel. It is harder to get down to the bottom of the Marianas Trench than it is to get up to the space station. I don't know how deep Challenger Deep is.
How do they measure the depth?
I know that current measurements involve satellites. I'm not sure what kind of signal they send down to map the seafloor. Originally, it was sonar related. They would send down sound waves and see how long it took for the sound waves to come back up. And you can get a pretty good estimate just from that. But I know that now that we're using satellites, they're not using sonar, but I don't know what they're using. All right, good questions. Good conversation. Anything else we want to know? Okay. So I spent a lot of time on marine environments. I'm not going to spend very much time on freshwater. They make up less than 2% of Earth's surface. And there's a lot of differences between freshwater ecosystems in different places. So it would end up being a really long discussion if we tried to do this, but we're talking about lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, and seasonal wetlands. Hi, Lola's dog. We are going to go on and spend more time talking about terrestrial or land-based ecosystems. So or biomes, I should use the term biome. When we talk about biomes on land, the terrestrial biomes are defined by two characteristics. The amount of rainfall or precipitation and the average temperature. Wow. So this is there are a lot of these charts out there. The x-axis is the temperature. It's in Celsius. So I put a little note over here for those who don't know Celsius very well. The human body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. So this chart goes up to an average temperature of 90 Fahrenheit, which is really, really hot, right? And then annual precipitation is in centimeters. When we look at these ecosystems, the warmest ecosystems tend to be in tropical areas and in the subtropical deserts. Tropical meaning, of course, closest to the equator. Further away, we call this area temperate. So these are deciduous forests, shrubland, temperate grasslands, and what are called cold deserts, deserts that don't get as hot as the subtropical ones. So these seem to be further from the equator, but not in the Arctic yet. And in the very, very cold areas, we have tundra and these boreal forests. And I'm going to talk about each of these systems just a little bit so you can see how this combination works. So tropical rainforests, of course, very hot, very wet. Southern California here, we are in this shrubland kind of habitat. And of course, I put lots of pictures up. So a tropical rainforest is a tropical rainforest, whether you find it in Central America, South America, West Africa, Southeast Asia, it's always going to be a tropical rainforest. There's a lot of diversity and a lot of organisms. So there's just lots and lots of life. Plants tend to have broad leaves, so not thin, narrow grass-shaped leaves, and they stay green year-round. So this area gets lots of water and high temperatures. Usually no yearly change or no seasonal change in temperature. Intensity of sunlight is pretty similar year-round. And rainfall is pretty similar year-round. So these areas don't have seasons the way we think of seasons. However, the soils are poor in nutrients. Now, part of that is because if there's nutrients, something has its roots there and is going to start growing. Part of that, so the rampant growth removes nutrients. And heavy rainfall can wash nutrients into rivers and other bodies of water. So these kinds of areas, when people want to farm there, they clear the jungle. They usually burn the vegetation so that all of the nutrients that are trapped in those plants end up in the soil. But after a couple of years, the soil just can't support crops anymore. So farming in these regions tends to be slash and burn. They slash the forest, burn the trees, use up all the nutrients in the soil, and then go to the next patch of forest and slash and burn and grow crops, and then go to the next patch and so on. These are great places to visit, but they're full of bugs and they're hot and humid. Hot during the day, hot during night. Okay. If we talk about tropical seasonal forests and savannas, we're still talking places that are close to the equator. They have fewer trees. They still have little temperature change. These are impala. They're I think impala are antelopes. Impala are really, really common. It's one of the most common hoof stock in Africa. And although you can't quite see it from this angle, if you look, they've got these black lines on either side of their white rump patch, and their tail is black. And the joke in Africa is that those black lines form an N, and they're the McDonald's of the savannas. They're fast food. Okay, so little temperature change, but usually seasonal changes in rainfall. So there's a wet and a dry season. And in a lot of places, when we think about these habitats, we really think of Africa, specifically Southern and Eastern Africa. And in those areas, the rains kind of move across huge parts of the continent from one country to another country in what used to be a very predictable pattern. And the animals would follow the rains. So you'd get rains, the plants would turn green, start growing again, and here come the hoof stock to start eating all of those freshly growing grasses. In these kinds of locations, this open forest savanna location, the trees are deciduous, meaning they lose the leaves, only they lose them in the dry season. This allows sunlight to reach the floor, the forest floor. We don't have dense forests in these areas. They're not like if you went up to Oregon or Washington or the eastern part of the US. But there is shading from the trees, and when the sunlight gets to the forest floor, that allows brush, shrubs, and things like that to grow. And the fewer trees that tells you there's less rainfall. So if you've got mostly this kind of habitat that you see in the background here, if you've got mostly that in an area, it's going to be more rain than what I've got pictured here, which is largely grassland. In addition to all of that, these places are fire adapted. There are relatively frequent wildfires during the dry season, just like we have here in California. But the plants there are adapted to the fires. They can survive burning. The roots will stay alive. And then they can start growing really quickly after a fire comes through. Yes, Jonathan, you make a good point. And in fact, if I look at this, I'd be willing to bet that there is a stream or creek or small river going through here. You're absolutely right. You can also see this difference if the soil here is able to hold on to water longer. That's a good point. This tropical seasonal forest and savanna is pretty similar to what we have here. There's some differences, but it's pretty similar. Then we can talk about the subtropical deserts. Certainly there are deserts that are closer to the equator, but not as many. These tend to be near the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. You guys know what the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn are?
Lines on the earth.
Yeah. Yes, they're lines on the earth. Yeah. So, you know, the equator is around the center. And then we've got these other, oh shit, latitude lines that go around the earth. And the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn are at, they're lines that mark kind of the edges of what we consider the tropical part of the planet. So one is north of the equator and the other one is south. And I forget exactly how many degrees and all that stuff. Okay, so right around near the Indian Ocean, we're talking about the lines that circle around the Earth. So they're going to be, it's going to cross the Indian Ocean, the Atlantic, the Pacific, all of the continents. All right, so these very low rainfall, and it's unpredictable. A lot of these are in what we call rain shadows. So they're near mountains or in mountains. And as rain moves through the area, it falls on one side of the mountains and the other side of the mountains just don't get any rainfall. And we can think of the Mojave and the Sonoran deserts. How did I misspell Mojave? So we can think of those as examples. Let's see, this one's got an awful lot of vegetation. Obviously, I mean, you can see the scrub growing here and the saguaros. Thank you. Thank you, Ethan. So this is probably the wetter time of the year. They've probably had rains recently. Generally speaking, deserts have relatively low diversity, low species diversity, and low numbers of organisms. There's not as much water to support life, so the life has to spread out. And seeds can lie dormant for years until there's a major rain event. Oh, I'm getting some learning in the chat. The Mojave Desert is named after the Mojave people. Excellent. Good to know. Now, because there's low water, there's low humidity. And remember when we were talking in chemistry about how water can help reduce changes in temperature and help regulate temperature in the body because of all those hydrogen bonds? Well, humidity is water in the air, and it can form hydrogen bonds, and it can help reduce changes in temperature in the air, just like it can do that in the body. So low humidity means high daily changes in temperature. What I mean is hot in the day and cold at night. Areas with a lot of humidity, the temperature doesn't change as much.
Wouldn't it be high daily changes in temperature?
Yes, thank you.
Uh-huh.
All right, looking at my clock, we're just about out of time today. Any last minute questions or comments? Obsidian Ridge. Oh, that sounds interesting. Oh, can we see the fungus? Oh, let me see if I can find it. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to see if I can find that fungus